Hey guys, welcome back to Empire of Prince. Today we are making a Phase 2 Commander Bly helmet with his binoculars. This file is a paid file from Galactic Armory, and it comes with all the parts pre-separated. This is for the mechanism for the binoculars. It's a great file, and I'm excited to work on this build, so let's get to it.
Now this helmet was printed in PLA on a Bamboo Lab P1S. So the first thing I'm going to do with this helmet is weld all the parts together with a plastic welder. Make sure you're wearing proper PPE. This stuff is very toxic. You do not want to smell this stuff. But I do this firstly just because it gives it a nice, strong, permanent connection, and it's going to make sanding a lot easier that all the parts are permanently held together.
Now that we have the helmet fully welded together on the inside seams, we can begin the kind of long sanding process. We're going to be doing a lot of sanding on this one, especially on these binocs. The lines are pretty bad up here because I printed it, I think, like this. So that means all of this is going to have a lot of lines. And these are two separate pieces, but I'm just going to glue them together. It's going to be a lot easier for the sanding process to just have a lot of these pieces together. And for now, I'm leaving these pieces off the helmet because if I were to put them on now and then build up a ton of filler primer in here as well as the rest of the mechanism, it might not work properly. It might actually clog up the mechanism. So I'm just going to hand sand those separately, glue them together, and then later in the primer process, we'll attach those on. I also, unfortunately, when removing some supports, took off a chunk of this like fin down here, whatever they call it, and I try to weld the hole kind of closed, so when I come in with some Bondo later, I'm gonna try to build this back up. But not to worry, I'm going to heavy weather this helmet, so it's really not a big deal, and it's kind of on a part that you can't really see. So I'm not too concerned with it. I wasn't gonna reprint this whole chunk just for this little break off. That seems silly. We'll figure it out in weathering. But otherwise, we're starting with our mouse sander. I'm out of 80 grit, so we're going straight to 220 grit. That just means we're gonna have to spend a little more time on the mouse sander and then maybe a little extra primer. But let's go on to sanding.
Now I definitely experimented with my process on this helmet. I definitely switched a couple things up, specifically going straight to 220 grit instead of my 80 grit. I wanted to see what I can get away with and how I could speed up the process for this. The 220 grit, with a little more effort, really got those lines out and kind of did what I wanted the 80 grit and the 220 grit to do combined. So I didn't feel the need to do 80 grit in this case. The helmet printed really smooth. I didn't have any weird print areas. So this was a great process to just go into, and it was a lot faster than doing the 80 and 220 grit. Now moving on to Commander Bly's iconic look with his binoculars, going straight with the 220 grit instead of the 80 grit. Now just kind of smooth it down, get those layer lines out. Don't sand one area too long because you will burn through the plastic and kind of warp it. So just make sure you're aware of that when sanding. So now I'm moving on to the first step of my filler process, which is an acetone Bondo kind of slurry mix. I go for a very watery consistency, really kind of thin it out, because when you're painting it over, if you get any drips, it's going to make it a lot easier to sand, kind of smooth down and even it out. So just be aware of that when you're painting this stuff over, and just take your time, get it in all the crevices, and we're going to start with this first layer and then wet sand it down. After the first layer of Bondo is dried, I immediately go into wet sand, and I start with a 400 grit wet sand. I don't do anything lower, because from what I've seen, if you go anything lower, it kind of removes almost all the Bondo really, really fast. And this stuff sands really easily. It's like super thin, but it fills in those kind of deeper imperfections that you want, kind of those smaller layer lines. So this is a really good step. It saves you some filler primer. It's just a really easy sanding process. This is a great step to add to any of your sanding processes on helmets or any other props you might be sanding. It saves you a lot of time, specifically on waiting for drying times. A filler primer, you might have to wait 2, 3, 4 hours to be able to wet sand it. This dried in 5-10 minutes tops. So it's really, really efficient for getting a lot of helmets out when you want to get some good props done and it's really easy to sand. So I recommend it for any sanding processes. It just speeds it up. You're not going to be able to not have filler primer. It's not a step you can neglect, but this just helps speed up the process. Here's where I kind of divert from my normal process. I would normally do another layer of Bondo acetone, but I wanted to see if one layer would be enough to kind of fill in those smaller imperfections. So I go straight to filling in the deeper imperfections with just some normal Bondo spot putty, just using my fingers. And make sure you wear a glove for this. You do not want this stuff on your skin. It is not good for you. It is toxic. Just make sure you're wearing proper PPE. But I'm just taking that Bondo and I'm going around all the seals, kind of making it look like one uniform piece, like it's been forged together in the Star Wars world. You don't want it to look like it's 3 separate pieces. So just go in on those deeper imperfections, maybe where your supports didn't support your print right and there's a little more lines than you would like. So just go in with that Bondo, smooth it out, and then we'll wait about an hour for it to dry. Once that Bondo is dried, I go into some Rust-Oleum filler primer. I love this stuff, works really, really well. Can wet sand it in about 3 to 4 hours. I wouldn't recommend the 2-in-1 filler from Rust-Oleum. That stuff always gunks up my sandpaper, so I wouldn't recommend that one for sanding prints. And then once that's dry, you want to go into another wet sand, just going in with some 400 grit, get it nice and smooth. And you're kind of just doing this same process until you get the desired texture and smoothness that you'd like out of the helmet. Go in with Bondo in any areas that might be deeper imperfections or any issues you might have. But once we're done with this process, we can move on to painting. Before we go on to painting the helmet, I almost forgot about all the little details. We gotta hand sand these down. I don't resin print them. I don't have a resin printer, so I always 3D print these smaller details. It does make sanding very tedious and very annoying. These pieces are really small, but you just got to take some 220 grit and really get in there. You don't need any Bondo acetone. Just simply hand sand these down with some 220 grit to kind of get that rough, smooth texture. And then about 1 layer of filler primer. These guys are already smooth and they're ready for paint. Now for the paint, I only used some white Rust-Oleum Ultra Matte paint. This stuff worked great. Gives you that really flat texture. I like the flat matte look. And then once that paint is dried, I normally give it 12 to 20 hours to dry, because if you do it any sooner, you're going to pull a lot of paint off. With our taping process, which I'm now starting, I always use frog tape. This stuff is really, really good. I always get sharp lines. The only reason you would get leakage is if you don't really push those edges down. Then you're probably going to get some paint leakage. Otherwise, this stuff works great. For Commander Bly's yellow paint, I used Yellow Oxide by Liquitex. I was a little worried it might be too orange looking at the bottle, but it ended up being this perfect flat yellow paint. I was really happy with how it turned out, and it came out of the airbrush so smoothly. I didn't have any issues with clogging or anything like that. While waiting for the yellow paint to dry, I moved on to taping up the binoculars. I was getting them ready to be airbrushed with some brown paint. Once I taped up the binoculars, I began unmasking the yellow paint from the helmet. I took my sweet time on this because I'm very prone to ripping off the white paint when I do my tape jobs. Luckily, I only had one little small piece on the front, which I tore off. I think it was because of a weird paint reaction, almost had a bubble in my paint. I was able to cover it up in weathering, but I was very happy with how this tape pulled off without any issues. Just take your time, go nice and slow. For his center stripe on his helmet, I pretty much just roughly estimated the width of the line and kind of just eyeballed it. Wasn't too difficult. You just gotta align the frog tape, kind of make sure each side is even, and then we can move on to painting it. For the brown color, I used Burnt Umber by Liquitex. I just put this in my airbrush and diluted it down to kind of a watery mixture. Sprayed it right on, got a nice flat brown look. I really like how this turned out, and I used this same color on the binoculars. Just make sure to give your paint a about 30 minutes to dry because I didn't give the yellow enough time to dry. When I was pulling the tape up, even though I was being very gentle, I did rip up a little bit of the yellow paint up, but luckily for me, it turned out really nice how it ripped up and gave it a nice scratch for weathering, which is our next step. Here's the damage that the tape ripped up, and honestly, like I said, looks really cool. I think it's gonna add nicely to the weathering process. So instead of using the normalized liquid latex, which is something you peel up after painting, I go in with an X-Acto blade and I do a very refined scratch. I like the detail, I like the control I have with this process. You just gotta take your time, go in different directions, different shapes, be as randomized as possible. Really make sure to go over those edges. It's gonna look really realistic and really cool when you're done with it. After scratching the paint with an X-Acto blade, I move on to hand painting, and I start by hand painting all these little details, and then we'll move on to hand painting the brow line and the helmet as well as the frown. Once I've painted those smaller details, I move on to painting the gray section above the brow, and then the frown at the front of the helmet. These, I personally like to hand paint these. I think it's way faster than taping the whole thing off and spray painting it or airbrushing it. But I do have a steady hand, so if you don't have a steady hand, I would not recommend this technique. So moving on to the most tedious part of this paint job, it is painting these groove lines. Galactic Armory has these built into the print, which I do love. It adds a lot of depth and detail to the helmet, but there's no easy way to paint them. Just do them the best you can. I just hand paint them in, and then I knew I was going to cover it up later in weathering, so I wasn't too concerned about the process. After gluing in all the detail pieces, I moved on to the first step of my weathering process, which is the weather wash. I kind of make it a motor oil consistency, kind of this muddy black water, and you just want to douse it over the whole helmet. There's no strategy to this. You just kind of throw it on and then you dab it off with a paper towel. Just make sure when you're dabbing it off with the paper towel not to wipe it off. You want to dab it off in different directions. That way you don't get a streaked line and it looks like you've just painted the wash. This will allow it to give it some texture and some depth to the weathering. So I decided to do some sandpaper weathering with some 1500 grit sandpaper. I normally don't do this, but I wanted to try it out to see how it looked, and I was really happy with the result. I thought it just added that little bit of extra scuffs and scratches to show that battle worn, to show that use, and I really liked the detail that it added. So before I put the binoculars on the helmet, I gave them a weather wash, and then I attached them because it would have been much harder to weather this helmet with the wash if they were on. I feel like I might have missed spots or I might have got drips in areas I didn't want. So I just made sure to weather wash it first before adding them to the helmet. So after I've added the binoculars, I move on to the chalk weathering process where I use some pastel chalks as well as some Mod Podge diluted with water. And I pretty much just put this in all the areas that I would like weathering. So for example, right here on the cheek, I'm doing a kind of a buildup of dirt in the cheek and the crevices, and I do this on the entirety of the helmet. I like to rub this thing in with my finger. It just really buries it in that crack and gives you that nice buildup of textured dirt. I think it looks so good. This is entirely up to you how much you want to do for this, but I like my helmets weathered. Commander Bly fought on dozens of planets, if not hundreds of planets. These guys were all over the place, and their last battle, being on Felucia, was an incredibly dirty planet. It had fungus plants, venomous creatures, weird trees. These guys were not clean in any way, and they fought some rough battles. So these guys are beat, they're dirty, they're weathered up. And I like to tell a story with my helmets. I like to show they've been worn in. They're pulled right out of the movie. But this is entirely up to you on how far you would like to go with this. But I really like to build that up, build a story with the helmets. And for those really deep crevices, I like to really build in that dirt, so I just sprinkle the chalk in with an X-Acto blade with some Mod Podge. It gives that really nice buildup of dirt in those deep crevices. Then I go into some dry brushing and I just put on some scorch marks and some black scratches throughout the helmet just to give it that added depth to the weathering. And to get that Revenge of the Sith look, I like to rust up the ears and where the mechanism is for the binoculars. I just think it looks so cool, like this helmet's really been lived in by this clone, and he's been around a while. To wrap up the painting process, I just had to paint this last little black strip on the back of the helmet. I always forget it. It's always the last thing I do on these clone helmets. I don't know why I forget it, but it is an important detail, so make sure we paint this in. For the visor, I'm just using a Hobart face shield from Amazon. I use this on all my helmets. I love this stuff. It's really great and it's really flexible. So we just hot glue that in there, and then I use my metal chicken mesh for the frown, and then this helmet is all ready to be shown off. If you've made it this far in the video, thanks so much for watching. I had a lot of fun making this helmet, as he's one of my favorite clone troopers, and I really look forward to continue to making these videos for you guys. I would really appreciate you liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.